All right, welcome everybody. I know it's a long day, and I'm really happy to see all of you, or kind of assume where everybody is, because this light is blinding. My name is Emma van der Ven. I will be your moderator later on, and I have the pleasure to introduce the general concept of insetting that has already been discussed and mentioned. If you're part of the previous session in this room, you've already heard it many times. I want to set the stage a little bit for the panel discussion later on. And so I'll run you through that in 10 minutes. But welcome to this session. It's a collaboration of MRV for SOC, MARVIC, Credible, Rabobank, ZLTO, Friesland, Campina, and Soil Capital, who we have a specific representative of. And so I represent Rabobank in this session. I won't talk too much about banking, more so about insetting. Later on, I will also present and introduce all of the panelists, but first let's dive into some general topics so we know what we're talking about. The reason that I'm standing here is because within Rabobank we've done a lot of carbon farming projects because we are a international bank specializing in agriculture and food production. And so of course, we face very many of the same problems that agricultural producers and food companies face, which is why we stepped into the space of helping carbon farming projects along in their process. So there are many challenges in the agricultural sector. I listed a few of them, but I want to focus on the bottom one, especially the high emissions associated with food production, which is, of course, why we need carbon farming. And then there are many ways to achieve that. I listed a few methodologies here to reduce our existing emissions and then to add removals in the future to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. I don't have to explain this to you. What I do want to focus on is the instruments to achieve these interventions. The bottom two, voluntary carbon markets and insetting. And I want to dive into a bit more detail on the difference between the two of those and how they could be complementary. So looking at the intervention side, there are many things a farmer could do. These are a few examples. All of them have different effects on the greenhouse gas inventory of the farm, and they have different price tags. So how do we group all of them in one intervention? The question is, who can pay for all these different interventions? Because we've established, at least over the last 1.5 days, that it's not the farmers themselves who can pay for all of the interventions you just saw on the previous slide. So the question is, in private sector action, which we are talking about today, what are the options to finance that transition to carbon farming type agriculture? And I'm showed the previous slides to say I am pretty much intervention agnostic. I don't mind what you implement on your farm. I acknowledge that most of that will cost money. And so we want to know in general which tools are there available in the private sector. And then the first one, of course, is to inset within the value chain, to say we want to see the impact of these interventions and we want to account for them within the value chain. The second is to offset your unavoidable emissions as a private sector actor, which is to say we cannot solve this in the value chain, so we go outside of it and we find ways to offset our residual emissions, those that are not part of our targets, so to say. So, some accounting differences, because I do want the conversation to also make sense in terms of carbon accounting. I ended up on the technical working group for the greenhouse gas protocol for land sector removals guidance, and then the actions and market instruments. I work with the Verra Scope 3 standard, both as a technical working group member and as a pilot tester. Worked with greenhouse gas, with SBTI on their flag standard. I'm very much in favor of proper accounting, and that's why I'm going to run you through this. It's going to be high over, but I want you to know the terminology so that our panelists later can refer to what I'm introducing now. We start with the allocation of carbon and the project location. Now, I know that in the previous panel, the Conservation International definition of insetting was used, and I want to go into a bit more detail. You can split insetting versus offsetting off into two categories. The first one is, where is your project located? Is it located within your supply chain or outside of your supply chain? And then the second question is, how do you account for the carbon? Where do you allocate the carbon reduction and or removal? You can take a picture if you want to, because I'm not going to go through every single example. All I'm trying to say is, if you use carbon reductions and removals in a project-based system to offset your corporate emissions, that means that the carbon leaves the value chain and is not tied anymore to the product. If you keep it on a product level, then it can be insetting if indeed the carbon is originated within your own value chain. So it's a little distinction between corporate offsetting compensation and product level carbon inventory. And the difference between here in more detail, you're talking about the difference between supply chain carbon accounting and intervention carbon accounting. Intervention and inventory, two different things. An intervention says, this is what's happening now, but if I do X, Y, or Z, something will change in the future, so the difference between now and the future is what I can monetize. The inventory says, I don't care what other people are doing, I only want to know what your entire inventory of greenhouse gas emissions is. And so that's a big difference in carbon accounting. The third one is about land use change. That's probably not going to be too relevant here. And then carbon allocation, of course, either to compensate for corporate emissions or on a product level. Please keep that in mind. You can imagine, I'm going really fast now because we started a little later, the buyers also differ. So for offsetting, we have a voluntary carbon market where all your offsets are interchangeable. And then for insetting, the buyers or the investors into your intervention are also your offtakers as a farmer. Those are the supply chain actors. So the liquidity of your intervention's impact is very different between the two of them. That leads us to the farmer's choice. Which of the two is a good choice for the farmer? I'm not going to advise any farmers today, I just want to explain the difference so you can make your own choices, because as a bank we are notorious for not advising but giving options. This is a bit of an overview of what it looks like. On the bottom part you can see carbon removals as an example, which can either be allocated in an offsetting system where they literally balance a corporate emission, or in an insetting system following the SBTi flag guidance, where they are part of the inventory of a cup of coffee at the end of the value chain. We've developed projects with many farmers in global south countries that are part of coffee supply chains, and so I use coffee as an example, but this can be done for any commodity. And so a bit of detail on the difference between the two of them for the farmer. We are talking about double counting if you're both bringing your carbon impact to an offsetting scheme and your supply chain is making a claim, which is what we want to prevent. But that means that you have to make a choice. You can't do both as a farmer. So for insetting, your carbon reductions or removals are still part of your own inventory. So if you have to report in your country of origin what your carbon inventory is, you can still report those impacts as well. Whereas if you sell them to an offsetting offtaker, you cannot report for these impacts, emission reductions and removals yourself. So that's a choice you make. It might be a more liquid market, maybe the price is better if your own commodity offtakers don't value the greenhouse gas reductions and removals, but it does mean you can't report on it for yourself anymore. And so, last but not least, why would the supply chain be interested? What does a product level greenhouse gas inventory mean? And so, there's a few things that we need to know. There's allocation, where each supply chain needs to know where the carbon came from, how to allocate it. And that's not as easy as it sounds, but that's one of the hurdles that we need to tackle. As you can see here, all the interventions, all the different commodities that come from this sample plot, which of the supply chains can make a claim on the reductions and the removals? Unclear. Then second, if there's a rotational system, then year on year, maybe your carbon in your soil, for example, increases. But how do you allocate that to the different commodities that are grown on the different years? Is the year that you don't grow anything the year that you sequester most carbon? in which, for which other commodity do you then allocate the carbon that is removed in the soil in this example. And then last but not least, if you talk about supply sheds and you make a generalized claim for a region, but maybe this region produces many different commodities and you don't know what the other supply chains are saying about that same region, there's again a big risk of double counting or triple counting in the case of the supply chains that I listed on the side of this slide. And so these are all more complex topics that need to be hashed out before we can make insetting a completely generalized standard. And I would like to hear the thoughts of my panelists about this as well today. Then to wrap it up, these are all of the organizations that I already mentioned and focus on carbon quantification. The question is, does CRCF fit in there? Would there be a role for CRCF to be part of the ecosystem that allows for insetting? I'd like to hear your thoughts, but when it comes to actually measuring the carbon before we make any quantified claims, my colleague Lisa is here to talk about an MRV system. Thank you very much for your attention.
So, hi everyone, my name is Lisa Vanderheyden and I'm working as part of the project MRV for SOC. And today it's a joint presentation and I'm very happy that we got the opportunity with MARVIC and MRV for SOC to work together on the socio-economical aspect of carbon farming, which is a big part of the research project that Horizon is funding. And why we talk about MRV after explaining the protocols? Because as it has been mentioned this morning by Amina Galliano, MRV is important for agri-food companies, but also for farmers, because it's really behind the liability mechanism. We need to know what we measure, so how much we store, and then how much it costs, and what's the relation between both of them. And today, we are not going to explain in details all the specification of MRV, or a little bit, but what we want here to state is the 3 challenges that we addressed in the panel discussion, and what is a way forward, and how research can support this way towards the implementation of the CRCF, so that key argument can be also bring into the panel discussion. And what we can see is that both insetting and offsetting require tier 3 methodologies. And the CRCF want to promote tier 3 methodologies such as measure, remeasure, and model, remeasure. But the thing is, quantifying carbon, it's not easy. Direct soil measurement is very expensive at large scale. And emission factor or simply models on themselves and remote sensing are way too inaccurate. And there is a call toward a model and measure, but we don't know how much it's cost effective. It has been highlighted by Smith in 2020 as one of the conclusions. Then, what are the challenges? You probably all know them. There is the value for farmers. It has been often shown that emission reduction on the market, the project does not represent real emission reduction. We talk about Vera and rainforest credit, but it's also general across all the sector. It represents that, like a recent study showing a review that 16% of the project cover real emission reduction. And with soil sampling, with carbon storage is very important, as we saw that there is a trade-off between cost and accuracy. So it creates uncertainty on the value for farmers on how much is stored, but also how much money would it get? Because price on the market are around 30 ton CO2 equivalent, 40. Those are results from 2022 in a French study. But we talked yesterday about 100 ton carbon CO2, and we calculate also some cost and carbon storage revenue. And in our study, we also come to that 100. But are buyers ready to pay for? So it's a balance between what we measure and what we pay and what farmers get. Then there is the lack of regulation that strengthens the uncertainty because multiple actors in the market, no standardized approach in the project implementation, no standardized protocol creates problems of reliability and credibility, but also cost variability, so cost uncertainty, and additional administrative burden. If you want to know more about that, I could, after the panel session, discuss about that. And then that's why research project comes and the socioeconomic impact comes, because part of those projects is to quantify what is the administrative and financial burden of MRVs at farm scale. In this study, we compared 3 MRV systems, so decision support tool, process-based, and direct soil measurement, on a specific study case in Wallonia, where we consider, in this case, a project of 20 farms, and it's one offset project, and we consider both the intermediary and the farmers working together to quantify carbon. And what we can see, I won't go into detail, we have every time a base scenario, a cost reduction scenario, so assuming an innovation that would reduce the cost, and then an innovation that would reduce the uncertainty. I would show, but I would speak very loud. What you could see is that there is a huge cost variability going from 2,000 to 42,000. And this is a magnitude there. It's an economic cost that accounts for both the opportunity cost, the labor cost, and the direct cost that you pay. And most importantly, what you can see is, beside the importance of soil sampling, is the cost of activity data collection. And this represents a real factor and burden both for farmers and intermediary, but also on the total cost over 5 years, as you can see, both for decision support tool and process-based model. And in this case, for decision support tool, we compare a case where farmers have a platform but not optimized, and a platform where it is encoding data are optimized. And this is a real study case. Soil Capital has observed that, that optimizing the decision support tools, I'll explain that here. So what you can see on the last part, if you optimize the platform where the farmer enters the data, you can, by connecting the farm information system, other existing database, you can really reduce the time by 50%. And what you can see here, it represents that you can reduce the cost by 40% over 5 years. So there is innovation, there is possibility to reduce cost, but there is also a question that process-based model and decision support that are tier 3 methodologies are expensive. And the CRCF wants to promote this innovation and and decision support tool is going to disappear because they are being replaced by process-based model. But the CRCF is also an opportunity. Why? Because the CRCF proposed an harmonized framework for different initiatives, offsetting, insetting, and CAPE instruments. They would allow to go leverage private and public funding, or private and public, and you could then think about maybe the private sector could compensate the carbon credit by implementing practices, and the public sector could pay the transaction costs. And this could also play on the trade-off between cost and revenue. But also, they would provide standardized protocols using tier 3 approach. Of course, nothing is perfect, but there is a working group working on how to trade with those questions, how to deal with. And MRV for SOC and MARVIC, they are part of this expert carbon removal. So it's just to say that we work on what would be the impact of the CRCF and how we could reduce costs, what could be the impact of the CRCF on those costs for farmers. And then, of course, research can help to address policy questions. And so there is different projects. There is MARVIC and MRV for SOC that are sister projects. There is Credible that allow to connect people as we are here, EGP Sol and OCASA, of course. Thank you.
So after laying the groundworks, it is time to ask our first 2 panelists actually to come up. I would like to ask Eduard and Stephanie. Eduard works for Agro Solutions. He's the head of carbon strategy. And Stephanie works for Ardo, and she is responsible for sustainability and for Region Ag. I actually think if you want to be here, you can go through the slides yourselves, or you can give me a hint on which slide you want. Okay.
Thank you. Hi all, I hope you can hear me well. So actually, on the low carbon transition of agriculture, we support farmers and value chain actors in deploying two types of MRV and reward schemes. First kind, carbon farming programs, Tier 3 MRV at farm level, covering both GHG emission and carbon removal. And the second kind, which is actually more older, Scope 3 reporting programs, mainly for agro-food companies, willing to be compliant with voluntary standards such as SBTi flag, GHG protocol, and tomorrow, the European and CRCF standards for Scope 3, I hope. We have been supporting Scope 3 reporting programs for agro-food companies for about 10 years now, and we monitor a whole series of environmental indicators, including greenhouse gas emissions, and more recently, carbon removals at the plot level. The agro-food companies we support face the following challenges. Achieving SBTi flag objectives without the risk of double counting and through an affordable and scalable business model. We are here with Ardo, one of the companies we work with, and they will speak after to explain their experience. But I explain a bit more what we do in general. To support a company in planning its transition, we define first the transition strategy and the objectives. So we first carry out a series of simulations to assess the transition potential and compare the different options. To do this, we work on both emission reductions and carbon removal levels by carrying out two types of simulations. First one, simulation of practice changes restricted to the culture concerned by the Scope 3 of our client. And second one, simulating practice changes at the scale of a whole crop rotation. For each simulation, we can calculate the cost of the transition for the farmer and the cost of the MRV, according to different scales of application. This is a necessary basis to set the economic model and the sizing of the reward mechanism. In general, we found that about 60% of the potential to improve the farm global climate balance comes from carbon removal as compared to GHG. And this is achieved by mobilizing carbon farming practices that cover the scale of the entire crop rotation. Such a transition, ambitious, covering both greenhouse gases emission reduction and carbon removal, is definitely the best suited to achieve Scope 3 climate objectives. But it represents three challenges for actors willing to launch Scope 3 reporting programs under such an ambitious transition. First is financing the cost. Carbon transition program, carbon farming type, is the one that costs the more, both in terms of cost at farm level, but also of MRV. Second, the allocation of climate benefit among crops and what falls within versus outside Scope 3. In a crop rotation, the one who finances practice changes at the scale of a whole rotation is not necessarily the one who can claim the climate benefits on its Scope 3. And third, lack of clarity on the claims out of Scope 3. Is it an offset claim, a contribution claim, a net zero claim? Who can claim what is not clear in a rotation. In any of the international standards, you would find a clear definition for this. And maybe CRCF can provide clarification on this matter. To overcome these obstacles in our project, we define allocation rules for carbon removals and greenhouse gases emissions, and we do so with a scientific committee linked to the French Label Bas Carbone certification framework. We also provide full transparency on the methodological choices and the results of a calculation. So we define and use these rules in our calculators, in our works, but for the moment, there is no common consensus on this matter, no common rules. That is why our recommendation is to set EU-wide common rules for what falls within versus outside Scope 3, allocation rule for carbon removals, and what can be claimed for whatever falls out of Scope 3 calculations. And if possible, have SBTi flag and GHG protocol aligned with this proposition at European level. This will make the economic model of the transition more fluid. This will make it possible for the same farm to stack revenue from Scope 3 premiums and offset carbon credits without risk of double countings. And now, I let the micro to Ardo. I don't know if you want to speak there or there, as you wish.
So thank you, Edouard. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephanie, and I work for Ardo. Ardo is a leader in frozen vegetables, herbs, and fruit production, and we are operating across 16 sites in 7 countries in Europe. And yearly, we distribute nearly 1 million tons of frozen products worldwide. A key strength of Ardo is that we work closely together with over 3,500 farmers across Europe, and they are supported by our 68 agronomists. And we really value this as a unique advantage, as we are able to influence what happens on the field directly through crop protocols and active field management. So sustainability really is at the heart of our business, as we started out as a family farm in the 60s. We have an ambitious sustainability program where, of course, agronomy and the transition to sustainable and regenerative agriculture is key. And since 2011 already, our MIMOSA program, MIMOSA stands for Minimum Impact, Maximum Output Sustainable Agriculture, has been driving this shift with an initial focus on input reduction while optimizing yields. But now we look further than the crop itself by also focusing on soil health, biodiversity, water, fertilization, and cover crops. As part of this transition, we also made a commitment to the Science Based Targets initiative with an ambitious FLEC reduction target, which is especially challenging for vegetables, as vegetables are already low in carbon, and we cannot use diet shifts to reduce our emissions. So to better understand our agricultural emissions and to reduce these emissions, we partnered with AgroSolutions. And first, we did a project with them to calculate the CO2 emissions of our top 10 crops across growing zones. And then we used primary field data for this. And then more recently, together with our agronomists, we identified the key decarbonization levers of our crops across growing zones, focusing both on CO2 reductions and carbon sequestration. And we also identified the associated costs and the deployment rates by 2030. But for Ardo, making the transition is much more than reducing CO2 emissions. We need and we want to improve the climate resilience of our crops and restore soil health. Because over the last 5 years, we have seen on average a 20% drop in yields of our vegetables compared to the 5 years before that. And this is really shocking news for our whole company. The reason is very clear, it's climate change. So extreme weather events such as droughts, prolonged droughts, or floods are having a direct impact on our vegetable crops, which typically have very short cycles on the fields. For example, spinach is only on the field for 6 weeks. So with climate change worsening, I ask all of you, how do you see the vegetable yields evolving over time on a global scale? So in 2025, Ardo decided to step up our efforts by introducing financial incentives for the farmers that are adopting a specific number of regenerative agriculture practices. This will be on a voluntary basis for farmers, but we need our entire value chain. We need our clients, we need banks and others to support us and to accelerate this transition to regenerative agriculture. Because Ardo and the farmers cannot bear the risk of change. If we want to feed future generations sustainably, we must share the responsibility. And as Eduardo already mentioned, there is a need for common rules on allocation of CO2 emissions and carbon sequestration in crop rotation cycles. But also existing frameworks and tools don't reflect on-the-ground challenges enough. For example, the SBTI flag reduction pathway, we really need a sector-specific reduction pathway for vegetables. But also, we need a common European unified language that not just works for companies, but also for farmers, because farmers often sell their products to multiple customers with different demands. But ultimately, the biggest challenge remains financing this transition. We must spread the risk of this transition across the entire value chain. And only by working together, we can ensure a resilient and a more sustainable food system for the future. Thank you.
Thanks very much for this introduction, and it's great to hear that you're already executing all of these practices in reality. I would like to welcome our other panelists on stage, one by one. Let's start with Sam Wisse from ZLTO. He is a carbon farming project expert. Please take a seat, and then we do a quick round of introductions afterwards. Next up is Paul Bos. He works for Friesland Campina as the corporate sustainability manager. And then we have Valeria Forlin, from DG Climate. She is a CRCF expert. And then last but not least, we have Andrew Voicey. He is the Chief Impact Officer at Soil Capital. Let's give them a warm welcome all together now. And for the panelists that haven't spoken yet, of course we talk about insetting, but my question to you is, what does a good insetting project look like? What are the right conditions? And how do you contribute to that? Let's start with Andrew, actually, at the end.
Thank you very much, Emma. Good afternoon, everyone. So, Soil Capital started life in 2013 as an independent agronomy firm, helping farmers to transition to regenerative practices and improve their farm profitability. And in 2019, we launched a large-scale program to generate new financial revenue for those farmers, to reward them for taking that risk. And that revenue comes from within the agri-food value chain. So insetting is what we've been doing since 2019. And for a sense of scale, we're now working with around 2,000 farmers across 5 European companies, and we've paid out more than 10 million euros to those farmers from the agri-food value chain. And that's obviously coming from a number of different agri-food companies. So to answer the question, the kind of conditions, I mean, there are plenty because it's a complex space, I think, as Edouard eloquently set out, but maybe 3 or 4 quick ones. I think the value chain buyers need to already be seeing the return on investment case. That's about more than Scope 3 targets. I think, as we heard just now from Ardo, from Stephanie, the resilience benefits, the security of supply are key. And if that's happening if you're talking to buyers, not others around them, and talking about buyers' budgets. And even better if they're showing up with their value chain partners ready to share that investment, which I think you both also talked to. So that's a number one sort of wow criteria. Number 2, for us, if the value chain is happy to incentivize the outcomes, the results, and give as much flexibility as possible to the farmers as to how they get there. Farmers don't need to be told how to farm. And every time we place a particular price tag on a particular practice, I think we can risk getting too close to that. And then my final 2, I think, and I would say this, wouldn't I, but our value chain partners say this to us, working with an independent entity that is not in the value chain, that is not handling the crops and processing them, is helpful. To work as an honest broker, to bring new expertise to bear. You know, there are undeniably trust issues in value chains. We know this. That's not controversial to say. And so I think having an honest broker can help, and that's a role we play. And then finally, I think scale. You know, we're going to talk about admin burdens and costs and so on. Pilots are fine to get started, but unless we're working at scale, the cost equations really don't work.
Thank you. Also great by means of introduction to what you do and the value you create. I want to go to Sam. Question to you as well. What does a great insetting project look like? And what is your contribution to that in your role?
Yeah, so I work at ZLTO, which is a farmers' organization in the south of the Netherlands.
Sorry to interrupt. Make sure you speak up because these microphones are a little sensitive.
Yeah.
And they're not as tall as you are.
Thank you.
It's
Yeah.
Dutch, please.
I'm Dutch, so. So I work at ZLTO, which is a farmers' organization, and over the last half year I have been in a project where I've run a lot of calculations for farmers, especially within the potato processing industry. So I've calculated both the carbon sequestration and the emissions, so the carbon sequestration on farm level and the sequestration on and the emissions on a crop level. And for me it's really important to the farmers to explain what I'm doing. So explaining what the difference is and how to calculate it, and also the single input and multiple output is very important to not ask a lot of the same data for multiple use. And to actually show that there are parties willing to financialize the lower emissions. So, and also the issues you can address in a certain production. So for example, with potato, I have a very specific example, is the type of variety that you use. It varies a lot on the emission. So those are the buttons you can push to show what it means for the total emission. So this is just one example.
Thank you. And Paul, over to you.
Yes, thanks. I'm with Friesland Campina. So Friesland Campina is a Dutch dairy processor owned by about more than 10,000 farmers in the Netherlands. So it's a cooperative, and I think that brings an interesting perspective to this whole discussion, because we do have scale, and we also have a program, an active program for almost all our farmers, where we actually reward them based on their sustainability performances. To just give an example, we pay, let's say, linear to the amount of emission reduction they achieve. So I think that's pretty awesome that we have established that within a cooperative with so many opinions and so many different views. So we've organized the flow of money towards the farmers. However, then of course the question is, where does this money come from? And that's where actually the team I'm in comes in. I work with the partnerships team. So we work with the big companies that most of you are familiar with, that actually buy a lot of milk, milk ingredients, milk powders, etc., to further process it into products that are brought to the retailer shelf or in food service, for instance. And I'm working with those partners to establish the programs, and that basically means designing bottom-up. So what are these farmers going to do? What are we going to? How are we going to help them financially with other means? And how are we going to actually make sure that whatever they achieve also benefits the buyer that actually invests in these programs and those farmers? And that's where it becomes pretty complicated. And today I've actually heard somebody say, biodiversity is easy, biodiversity is difficult, carbon is easy. I thought, carbon can be pretty difficult as well. Once you start basically reporting carbon footprints or emissions to customers. And this is in line with what we've said about insetting. There's some challenges that we definitely need to address, and we need to address them, I think, within the next 2 or 3 years, or we lose precious time. But let's talk more about that.
I have some follow-up questions, surprisingly, but we'll save those for later. Valeria, I would like to go to you. Of course, you are not an insetting practitioner, but I'd love to hear a bit about the work that you do and how you see your role potentially also for insetting, if any.
Yes. Yeah, thank you, and thank you for the panelists for the very good insights so far. I'm looking forward to more. So the CRCF from the start had the goal of being a harmonized set of rules for measuring and reporting climate impacts, but also sustainability impacts of carbon farming practices. And the initial idea, was to not go immediately into the use of the units coming out of this framework. We wanted to focus on the quantification only. This being said, as it is now, it is still producing different type of products, the framework itself. We talked a lot since yesterday about carbon credits, which is definitely something the CRCF can be used for. We have rules for additionality, so we have rules to identify in a carbon farming practice what part of this of the impact is additional and can therefore be converted into units that can be recorded on a registry and sold. But there is also the certificate itself. So each unit that is certified under the framework has behind it a certificate, a piece of paper with a lot of information about the activity, not only the additional part of the impact, but also the overall impact of the activity, including in terms of sustainability, not only carbon. So in that sense, the carbon farming certificate could be useful in the context of insetting because it will provide a lot of information in a standardized way to the food supply chain who wants to invest in more sustainable practices. I liked very much what Sam said, single input, multiple output, which is a way to say what we are focusing a lot right now, that farmers have to provide this sustainability data only once. This is the idea behind the benchmarking system, which was one of the main recommendations from the strategic dialogue, this group of stakeholders that last year met and provided recommendations to the Commission about the future of the agriculture and food sectors. This single benchmarking system is something that we also picked up in the vision that was published 2 weeks ago, the vision on agriculture and food. And I think the mission is really clear. So the mission is farmers should provide this data only once, and this data then should be then the same that will be used by food companies for insetting, by the CAP authorities for checking compliance with CAP rules or CAP eco schemes, by national inventories or national statisticians who want to understand the big trends of agriculture in their sector. So I think CRCF is a good step forward in this idea of a benchmarking system, and I think it will benefit not only farmers but also food companies who want to do insetting programs. But the details are all to be defined. So.
Excellent. Well, after your introductions, I'm comfortably saying that we have a full value chain representation from farmer organizations to CPGs and from policymakers to input providers, me being the bank. I like having all of you in one space because I think the real questions around making an insetting system work. As my colleague Olga always says, if it's a win-win system, then why isn't anyone winning yet? I think that's what I'd like to challenge today. I'm not claiming that quote, that's Olga Panchenko. Maybe the question to you is, and I'll leave it to you to respond on your own accord, I won't go along the line. What are the biggest hurdles that you see? And where do you see also a solution in the shape of policy? Feel free to jump on the question. Of course, Eduard.
Yeah, I start maybe with the most simple explanation. We lack of a strong and scalable economic model to finance the transition. And the difficulty we have when we want to transition a farm is that for the moment, we need to choose beyond different sources of payment. Scope 3, grain premiums on one side and carbon credits on the other side. And it's really difficult to stack different kind of payments because of its risk of double counts. So if we manage both to set clear rules to allocate the claims, then we'll be able to, for the kind of transition I mentioned at the scale of a whole crop rotation, the ideal would be to stack payments of the different buyers of the different crops. So it would reduce the cost of each and any buyers, and we're working on many experimental programs in France with a lot of agro-food industries that all face this issue. So how can they collectively finance their share, but not too much? So we're working on allocation rules, and then it's about the MARVIC digital tools that need to automate those calculations and automate the data collection. But, and finally, all these elements we are working on, we feed the DigiClima works through the MARVIC and different projects we're working on so that it can directly feed the European policy.
Maybe I can add a few comments to that. And again, I'm with a big corporate, almost unfortunately I should say, because I'm actually a biologist, but took a wrong turn somewhere in my career. Worked for the same bank as Emma did, but of DOS. But the message is actually a bit more hopeful because we do see really strong commitments from our buyers to participate in these carbon reduction programs. Where they look more into the emission intensity of the milk that we supply to that. So they are using that vehicle indeed to structurally invest and co-invest in emission reduction. So that's pretty hopeful. And of course there will always be a group of customers which don't have perhaps the capacity or not the priority. And I think there we need to find different solutions, and credits would be helpful. But for us at the moment, the issue is now more that as Eduard was also saying already, that there's lack of guidance on how to actually allocate the performances of the farmers to your customers. And that's a pity, because we have been on this roadmap with certain customers already for 5 years. And now there are guidelines actually being developed and produced that prevent these partnerships to continue. So this is where we struggle with, where I'm spending like 4 days a week on this topic, to actually make sure that the companies that invest also get the full reward of their investment. Otherwise you get this pretty destructive free rider effect. And that's also a reality that we do see a lot of, well, we do see some customers that also understand that if I don't do anything, I'll just wait for Friesland Campina to meet its SBTI goal, because then I also reach my 30% target. And that's, I think, a destructive attitude. So we need to prevent that.
Yeah, maybe I could come in on that, because I have something quite similar to say from our experience. I mean, if you talk about why isn't the win-win happening, I think, you know, we could start to talk about the admin burden for the farmer and the costs and so on. And there are real issues there, but they are overcomeable, which is not a word, but I think you know what I mean. And you know, our journey working with 2,000 farmers, we have, as Lisa showed earlier, massively reduced the time needed, the cost of obtaining activity data from farmers. And actually, we had an audio recording circulating internally this morning from a phone call with a farmer who's absolutely delighted using our platform. So these things, we've got a long way to go, but those things I think can be overcome. It's the free rider effect, which I think is the biggest sort of elephant in the room here. You know, we've dispersed, as I said earlier, 10 million euros to farmers from the value chain, but that's coming from the leading players, the Friesland, it's not Friesland Campina, but like you, companies who are willing to put your money where your mouth is and take a leadership step. And increasingly, they're turning to us privately and saying, you know, we need a level playing field here throughout the value chain. for our customers and suppliers and peers to do the same thing, because we talk about resilience as a driver of return on investment, but in a commodity value chain that can be complicated to link the actual value at farm level to the actual company who's investing. But that case makes sense if everybody is rising the tide at the same level, at the same rate. So, very often I find in conversations around CRCF, CRCF is about the supply of units into the market, and we're not talking much at all about the demand from within, in this case, the agri-food value chain, and I think there needs to be much richer conversation there. However, last point, I do think, to your point, Edouard, that for the first time, actually, we have an opportunity where one of the other things that holds all of this back is too many conflicting standards. GHG protocol for insetting or scope 3, a whole bunch of voluntary carbon market standards for offsetting, then a whole bunch of stuff around public sector funding, which is somehow finding its way to the farm level as well. And the poor farmer, of course, is in the middle of all of this saying, what on earth do I do with all of this? For the first time, we have an opportunity to have a government-backed quality standard that could, details to be resolved, speak to all sources of funding and offer a harmonized quality stamp. And I think that can at least, it won't solve all of the issues. I'd be amazed if it solves the allocation issue, frankly. But it can solve a lot before getting to there, and I think that can help.
I would like to add something from Ardwa's perspective. I feel like that the biggest challenge is convincing farmers that this is the way forward, because we can collect all the money and the financial incentives, but if we don't have any farmers to give the incentives to, and if they are not convinced that regenerative agriculture is the way forward, then I think we should start at the bottom and really facilitate this knowledge exchange and create an ecosystem for farmers to learn from each other and to speed up the transition. And then all these tools and frameworks and regulations can help.
I have some ideas as well.
Please share.
When you look at arable farming, and I'll make it specific in the southern part of the Netherlands, clay soil, I also have a project where I work together with arable farmers and dairy farmers. And for the dairy farmers, the emission calculation is very easy. So that's something we draw a lot of inspiration from Friesland Campina. But when you look at an arable farm, you have different crops and different suppliers of the crops. So let's say you have a farm and half of the farm is wheat and the rest is potatoes and beets, for example, sugar beets. Then you generate a certain amount of sequestration or lower emissions. So where are you going to allocate the emission? That's a very big question for farmers that I often have to explain. So that's, in terms of hurdles, one of the things that I've seen.
Maybe one last word, that the CRCF, the way it is going, could be a marvelous solution to harmonize all the kind of reporting, and could be a solution to all the challenges we've mentioned that for the moment agro-food companies face. So that's why we need to work together towards this harmonized framework.
Yeah, and I appreciate that many of you mentioned allocation as an issue. That is very recognized. I like that between Ardo and Agro Solutions, you made your own solution for that. The same for Friesland Campina, of course. You started years ago already, and then you saw the policies change. I think summarizing what you're saying is you want to move so fast that the policy is lagging behind, and then you run the risk of making an assumption that turns out wrong. But I have to appreciate the work that you've already done in that policy void, without knowing exactly what's going to happen in the end. Same goes for soil capital. You've really moved beyond what you already saw out there in the market. So from that perspective, maybe you've all been part of projects that started before there was an established framework. How do you look at value creation and value capture of those projects? And what do you think are more the best practices? And how should we reward this? What are systems that work? What hasn't worked yet for you? I see some twinkling eyes for Andrew, but maybe you don't want to be first.
I'm pausing. See who.
Maybe, I mean, for good practices, I think I won't. I mean, we know what are the good agricultural practices, but maybe to stress one point is that there is a limit with the scope-free approaches, is the lack of physical traceability from the grain to the end users. For the reason that in the agricultural value chain, at some point you collect all the crops from the fields and you mix it in the silos. And it's just physically impossible to provide food grain traceability to all agro-food companies. So at some point, we also need to align CRCF rules with mass balance rules and mass balance approaches harmonized at country and European level to match both financing by value chain and offset finance. Maybe it's one of the biggest conclusions we can have, because for the moment we've been working mainly with agro-food company that has this direct full traceability, also with agro-food that has a mass balance approach, but the vast majority of grains can't be addressed with something else that mass balance.
I put the slide on. I saw some sort of tired eyes while I was rushing through my presentation. I skipped this slide. But this is what Eduard is referring to when he says mass balance, which is a way to allocate from different product streams, in the end, a claim. Anyway, wanted to put that visually as well, so it supports what you're saying. Thanks.
Emma, maybe to come back to your value capture versus value creation question. It's a big question and there's lots to say, but maybe kind of coming back to Stephanie's point about bringing the farmers along. You know, all of this makes no sense unless it resonates really clearly with farmers and supports them to change farming practices. It's kind of obvious, but it's kind of helpful to come back to that. And I suppose there's two things that you trigger with the question. Firstly, I don't know if there are any farmers in the room, but we've certainly got people who work with farmers here. I would be very nervous using the phrase value capture to a farmer in this context, because what they're hearing is, I do all the hard work and you get the benefit. You're capturing the value from me. So even just with the language we use, I think we have to be extremely careful, but I think that points to the underlying mindset, which, you know, I'm much more comfortable with the notion of value creation. And I thought your earlier slide about, you know, the contrast between offsetting and insetting is relevant here, because in our conversations with farmers, and for context, this is Belgium, France, UK, Ireland, Poland, there is nervousness about the mechanism of offsetting very often, because of this idea that the value that's been created is then transferred and captured by someone else for reporting. And what if my value chain, my crop buyer or my product buyer, then comes along saying, well, actually, I need to know the carbon footprint of your product if you want to sell to me, and it needs to be getting better and better. And the farmer fears having given away or sold the value outside of the value chain. And I think that can be a real factor in not bringing farmers along if they feel that there's this quite complicated choice to make, very novel concepts, frankly. That alone, in my experience, can be enough to break the engagement with a farmer, you know, once you've talked about the agronomy. So, you know, that brings me back to why this kind of conversation is so valuable, because I think we need to get the mechanisms right for the value chain, creation to work, because that's where the value is shared between the parties rather than exchanged from one to another.
Maybe I can elaborate a little bit on the value creation. Going back to potatoes again. There was a year in the Netherlands where there was a lot of drought and the potatoes were short. So the factory could not produce long enough fries, or not enough long fries. So a few weeks ago I had a discussion with a group of farmers at a potato factory, and they said, well, why can't we just sell shorter fries? Why can't anyone be happy with that? And they said, well, that would be nice, but we actually strive to sell the long fries because they're highest in value. So we need to keep striving for that. So if you use another variety, still we would like to have the long fries. So if you can achieve that, then you have a sector which can produce a lot of revenue, which is also able to go back to the farmers and say, you put your effort into this crop and we can give you some of the money back. So maybe that's also an example of value creation and importance in a specific crop. And I'm actually quite curious maybe how, Stephanie, how you look to this concept. So creating high value from the crops that you produce. You could say, I can sell the potato, but I can also make French fries out of them and they're higher in value.
Yeah, for us it all depends on the customer requirements as well. But we feel that often our customers, they don't know the challenges, first of all, of the farmers, but also, for example, they say we want indeed a fries that is this long, or like a pea that is this small, not bigger, so we have to discard a lot of food because our customers just have very different specifications. But yeah, the biggest value is in selling as much products as possible, also for the farmers, for the inputs that have been put into growing the crops, but also in freezing the products. So I think there's also a need for a mindset switch from customers and end consumers on the way we consume food.
Yeah, we can make a parallel with the wheat sector. We work a lot with hard wheat. They have high expectations on the amount of proteins in the wheat, but to make proteins you need fertilizers, and it's the first source of greenhouse gases emissions. But if you want to reduce the amount of proteins, you need to adapt the value chain so that you can process a grain with a lower amount of protein, and you need to adapt the taste of the consumer. So it's a whole change of society and industry that we need if we want to cultivate differently.
Valeria, you already mentioned that CRCF is, let's say, buyer agnostic in essence. Do you see an opportunity for CRCF to also step into the space of value creation and value rewarding, and to be prescriptive there as well?
Again, I'm not sure about what you mean by value creation, but for sure, after focusing for the past couple of years on creating the supply of high-quality carbon removals and soil emission reductions, we are definitely stepping into looking at the demand, creating a demand for carbon farming action unit certificates. So in particular, now the date is still to be defined, but whether either on the 20th or 21st of May, we will have an online workshop, hybrid, in-person online workshop on financing carbon farming, where we look into innovative approaches for that. And for 2 years now, we have been also doing studies, workshops, interviews, a lot of thinking about how to create policies for the next decade, so after 2030, to incentivize climate action in the agri-food value chain in its entirety, through market-based approaches, so not only national targets, but also something that engages with the agri-food value chain to contribute to the reduction of emissions and carbon removals in the agricultural sector. So we have a lot of ideas there, but again, we find the same struggles, difficulties that were already discussed in this panel, including the relationship between a food producer and its suppliers when it comes to buying food and when it comes to rewarding carbon farming. Do we need to keep these two relationships always together, or can we break these two channels so that we can simplify all these problems of allocation rules? So to be more clear, if as a food producer you can claim that you have reduced your Scope 3 value chain emissions, not because you have paid your own supplier for reducing emissions, but because you have paid some supplier of the same type of food in the same region, but not necessarily the one who sold you the food. This could simplify a lot these allocation problems. But what you were saying before, Andrew, and many others have said, that what a buyer is interested in is the return of investment in terms of the resilience of its supply chain, reducing risks in its supply chains. This is something that requires a strong link between the money you put on the table and the resilience of your own supply chain. So from that perspective, this link cannot be broken. So I think we still have a lot of thinking to do, how policies can best incentivize and simplify these approaches. But what is clear is that we need the private sector to be engaged as a whole, like you were saying, the pioneers are very much appreciated, but now it's time for the whole sector to reach the same level playing field if we want the transition to have the scale that we require. Because yes, there is a common agricultural policy, of course, which is there and which can help a lot, but I think we can all agree that we need both public and private finance, considering also the limitations of public budgets in the current situation. So we are thinking a lot about these things, yes.
Excellent. Maybe that's...
Emma,
yeah.
can I add one point or a small challenge to that? Because I think this is exactly what needs to happen. Mm-hmm. The only thing is that in the meantime, we want to continue with our customers, and we want to make sure that whatever money they put in also is sort of has a value in the future. So I think the request here is basically to make sure that in the meantime, we allow companies to set up partnerships and to set up projects that still have a value in 3 years' time when the final guidelines perhaps are there, or when the final system is there. And I can think of a sort of a grandfathering system or something, but for us that's really critical. And to be honest and be transparent, like I think we have seen quite significant interest in soil carbon projects, in reduction projects. But now, really, companies are questioning: should we take the next step, or should we pause here for the next 2 years and then continue? And that's, I think, lost time that we cannot afford in this world. So, a small request to also consider that potential risk of, and maybe introducing some elements that could help that risk.
I think you perfectly answered the question I wanted to ask to all of you, which is, if you have the opportunity to give advice, maybe for CRCF, how can we amend what's already there? How can we make it better for the purpose of insetting? What would you say, not just to Valeria, but also to all the other people in her team, in ideally 1 sentence, 2 if you must, because I want to save space for the audience to ask questions as well. Paul, you already had your turn.
Grandfathered the answer.
Sorry. Yeah.
I'll have a go. I'm not sure about 1 or 2 sentences, so maybe this will leave more questions in your mind than answers. But
that was 1.
That's the preamble in policy speak. I do not think the current CRCF methodology is as explicit as it needs to be to tell the agri-value chain that the units and the data associated with it can be used in inventory accounting. And if we get that wrong, I fear that we switch off a major source of potential investment for this transition. And I think that was 1 sentence because I added an "and" in the middle.
You can do another if you have to. So inventory versus intervention is what you're saying.
I'm not allowed to say any more. But yes, I think your earlier slides about inventory and intervention accounting have a lot to do with what I'm thinking. I think there is a lot in the design already that works, but it's a bit hidden for a company to have to know that you can go to the certificate behind the unit and so on. Yeah. And I think unless you make things explicit in this day and age of so much complexity, the very big risk is that the market won't see that signal. Yeah, no, and I think we can, easily include some sort of explainer or something in the delegated act that can help with that.
My point would be to consider one-fits-all methodology, so that with one collection of data and one MARVIC application, the farmer could calculate all its climate benefits and answer all the climate claims, scope 3, offset, insetting, and offset. I mean, we're already working into this direction through the MARVIC program and other projects. So I'm quite confident.
And I would say don't forget about the co-benefits of carbon farming, because it's about more than just carbon. It's also about biodiversity and soil health and all the other topics as well. We should not forget to take a holistic approach.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. So maybe repeating you a little bit, Eduardo, with the single input, multiple output is something that a lot of farmers stress. So, and especially the other benefits. It's quite clear, yeah.
All right, thanks very much. Do you want to add any last points, Valeria, or do you want to see what other questions come up?
No, it's good.
All right, it's time to find the mobile microphones. Also, I can't see anything, so I'm counting on someone else to walk around. There was one in the back.
There are two over there.
Emma, yeah, they're here.
Oh, it's right there. Oh, thank you, Lisa. Who wants to ask a question? Wave at Silvia and Lisa. And maybe state your name and also the person you would like the question to answer. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Rachel, I'm from the UK Levy Board, AHDB. This question's probably more for the panellists that representing the sort of the downstream element of the supply chain. And I'm just interested to know what your thoughts are in terms of the backdrop of actually climate adaptation and the fact that our changing climate is really, it's really challenging at farm level, and actually what you're doing within your projects, within your schemes, that builds in climate adaptation strategies within Insetting. Thank you.
I can maybe respond to it a little bit. I also work in the project Climate Farm Demo. So there we have the opportunity to ask really specific issues, for example, related to climate change. The area where I'm working mostly has suffered a lot with drought. So water supply and infiltration of seawater has become quite an issue. So in that way, we can target these specific things while also calculating carbon sequestration at the same time. It is limited, but maybe that's an example.
And for me, mitigation and adaptation often go hand in hand, because if you have like a healthy soil that can store a lot of water, it will be more resilient to extreme weather events such as droughts and floods, and this way you're also adapting.
Yeah, fully support that, and maybe to add a data perspective, because as agronomists we've always known that that would be true, and now we're in a position where we can start to analyse the data from our own farmers against climatic shocks or extreme weather events. And this is only for one harvest and one region in France, the Charente region, so I'm not saying this is a universal trend, although it aligns with the agronomic experience. But we looked at a cluster of our farmers in that region where there were very clear prolonged drought events, and we categorized the farmers into those who had done the most to improve their soil health and those who had not. So a bit crude, but a broad categorization. And what we saw was that the volatility of yield was 50% less in that region for the farmers with the presumed better soil health compared to the farmers who were earlier in their transition with less healthy soil. And actually, when you look at not just their output volatility, but their profitability as well, it's an even bigger resilience factor. And that's, I think, what we're talking about when we're talking about resilience and the return on investment. A more stable output during these shocks means that off-takers don't have to go somewhere else when everyone else is going somewhere else to buy on the spot market. But linking buyer and supplier to that ROI is the challenge. But I fully agree. It's all part of the same. It's two sides of the same coin, and maybe our language of carbon farming sometimes distracts from that.
Let's take another question. I know that Silvia has been eager.
Hello.
The mic's not working, but...
Yeah, it is.
Now it's working. Yeah. I have a question to Valeria, to the panel overall. I think the offset claim, in order to get carbon neutral or net zero through compensation, is linked to a corresponding adjustment, at least by the bigger international protocols of ISO, SBTi. Did I miss something, that this has been already resolved by the European Union to say, okay, we are providing such corresponding adjustment, or how is your position on this?
Under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, there is an obligation of corresponding adjustments when these credits are sold between parties to the Paris Agreement. These are countries, or in the case of ICAO, the aviation sector. So there is no obligation of corresponding adjustment when credits are sold, for instance, by German farmers to a French food company. There is no obligation for the German national inventory to adjust the emissions in the German inventory, because these emissions were reduced on the German territory. So we don't really see this need for corresponding adjustments, if this is what you meant. Your microphone is not working.
Yeah. Yes, this is what I meant, but if you read the SBTi and ISO, I don't know if you should be part of ISO, at least from my understanding, the national governments are part of this, then you should be flagging that your position is currently different than the ISO position, because that is not what the ISO protocol are saying if you want to become carbon neutral.
You mean the greenhouse gas protocol?
No, the ISO 1468. 1468, which is a carbon neutrality protocol in order to reach carbon neutrality, and there, it's stated differently as you're currently saying. And this is for products or companies eventually to become carbon neutral, not for the countries.
Between companies, you mean? So I thought your question was about corresponding. When I hear this question about corresponding adjustment, usually people ask about between the company level and the national level. So that was what my answer was referring to. Of course, between two different companies, they cannot both claim the same reduction of emissions. So this is all the problem of double counting we were speaking about. If a farmer has sold carbon reduction, emission reduction or carbon removals as offsets to an airline company or a oil and gas company, then they cannot also, these reductions cannot also be claimed by the food company who buys the food from the farmers. This is, I think, what was already mentioned. There is a problem of double counting, and then it's also a difficult choice for the farmer, like Emma explained in the beginning, who do I give my carbon to? So yeah, in that sense, for sure, I wouldn't call it corresponding adjustment. It's just do not count this twice. So in the CRCF regulation, we intend to address this risk with an EU-wide registry of carbon farming units, so that we know that a farmer has produced these units once, and they can only be bought once, cannot be bought by different entities.
Okay,
so
but
maybe this is more a reply to your initial
can the company still make the claim to be carbon neutral through compensation then?
If I may.
This is all another discussion about green claims that is still ongoing. So the Green Claims Directive is going to have rules about what claims can be made in terms of carbon neutrality, but this is still under discussion between Parliament and Council.
But shouldn't this be the start of the discussion, because that's the value which comes in as a financial value for companies in order to give then to credits the money in order to be forwarded to the farmer?
I think I wrote this down on my list of things that we really need to look into. We can't solve it today, but thank you so much for flagging it.
Just to conclude, that was also one of the reasons why we couldn't talk about uses of the units so much until now, because we are waiting for the end of the trialogues of the Green Claims Directive.
And just a word, there is no single proposition in any international standard on the claim from a offset what is outside the scope 3 in the carbon farming in agriculture. This is a problem we face with Label Bas Carbone in France, so it's not only a European question, but this needs to be solved at international level. So this was part of a recommendation to provide a clear claim for whatever falls out of scope 3.
Are there any other questions? There's a very eager one over there. Hi.
Afternoon, and thank you everybody for your very interesting and stimulating talk. My name is Carl Richards. I'm head of the Teagasc Climate Centre. So within our organisation we have a virtual centre where we manage all of our climate related research. I have a question for you around early adopters. So when we look at emissions from farmers, I'm assuming there's a bit of a bell-shaped curve there. Some farmers are already very efficient. Everything that's been talked about here is about reducing emissions, but we can select to take supplies of milk, for example, or beef from farmers that already have very low footprints. So how are early adopters going to be treated, or is it all going to be about, I suppose, how much more CO2 can I reduce now? So if I'm already very efficient, reducing that further becomes incredibly difficult, but I'm already very efficient compared to the average. So how is that going to be handled within the systems that you're talking about? Because, sorry, the reason I ask this is we get asked by farmers, should I go now? Should I sell my carbon now, or should I wait? So do I implement the measures now, or do I wait for a few years when the price of carbon is higher, the payments are more certain, and I will get more money for whatever actions I carry out on my farm? So, thank you.
I mean, this is a great question, one that I struggle with a lot myself. And we have this bell curve. We have a footprint from every farmer that supplies to us. So it's a great data set. But the honest answer is that today the market does not necessarily want a carbon footprint. They want a carbon footprint in the future. So they want the reduction pathway going forward, because that's basically what they need to address and need to solve. So also the short answer would be too bad, and life is a little bit unfair in this case. We do reward farmers that have low carbon footprints, but for us it's a struggle to actually match those farmers with customers, because customers want, let's say, this future footprint. And maybe it's an omission in SBTI or in whatever standards out there, but you can also argue from the other side, perhaps if a farmer is already low in emissions or is doing a removal, it is maybe already in a better financial position anyway. It may be already benefited. So it's a bit of a delicate matter that we haven't solved yet, but to me it feels also a bit like life is a bit unfair sometimes, and maybe you are already in a better financial position, you already reduce your inputs, you already have lower costs, so it's really hard to assess whether it's really unfair. Let's put it that way.
I also think it's a very good and important question. You know, whenever you talk to a farmer, it's definitely within the top 5 questions, if not the top 3, because everybody is feeling proud of what they've already done. It's quite logical. And I think if you just take a pure voluntary carbon market logic to answer your question, there is no good answer, because the voluntary carbon market for offsetting needs to see additional action. And so that's where the conversation kind of ends. But that's not good enough. And that's not good enough for several reasons. And one of them is very powerful, which is, who do farmers learn from best? It's no one on this panel, it's other farmers. And so if you deliberately by design, I said you, if we exclude the pioneers, the early adopters, the first movers from a system and disenfranchise them and make them feel excluded, that's gonna be a problem. And I'm sure you kind of see that in your everyday conversations. We actually do see that agri-food value chain companies that we're working with do value the better carbon footprints now, because it does help them advance on their target trajectories. But I'd also like to broaden this from just pure carbon, because to talk about the resilience piece again, You know, the farmers that have already done the hard work and have better soil are the ones who are today experiencing less yield volatility, and that's valuable today. So that's why I do think it's important we continue to work on the early adopter question, and my earlier point about making it really clear in the CRCF methodology that the output from this methodology can be used in the agri-value chain matters for many reasons, but one of them is I do believe the agri-food value chain is one of the best stakeholders to value those early adopters when you look at the whole sort of spectrum of other potential funders, not even talking about the public sector, but other private sector funders. So I think all hope should not be lost, is the too long didn't read summary.
And this is also where the proposition of a CRCF to have a generic baseline can help, because generic baseline can valorize the early adopters. But then you need to find a solution for the ones who can improve a lot.
I sometimes feel like we should also value what the farmers, what they already have. So if they already have a high carbon soil level in their soil, then that should also be of value, but I think that's really difficult.
And Stephanie, you mentioned earlier that you're dealing with crops that are already very low in their carbon emissions levels, and you still set ambitious targets for those crops and also for the farmers. How do you translate that also to your farmers who already have achieved very low carbon production results?
Yeah, it's not per se the farmers that have achieved low carbon products, but it's more that vegetables as a product, they are low in carbon. But yeah, the main decarbonization levers are of course fertilization, but then we have over 50% of our acreage that are leguminous crops, which naturally fix nitrogen from the air, so we cannot use the fertilization lever there. So yeah, we really have to be inventive. But of course, the biggest decarbonization lever for us is the yields in the fields. If you have a lower yield, you will have a higher carbon intensity per ton of product. So yeah, yields are key.
All right. Well, thank you for your questions, and panel, thank you for your answers. I'm sorry, I am already over time, and I know we don't really have a break. So I would like to thank all of you for your input, and if you have more questions, find these panelists afterwards. I would be curious to hear your questions and the answers. There is no time. Let's put our hands together and wrap this up. Thank you.